Well, good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you to what is going to be an extremely interesting and timely discussion with Sir Freedman, who has returned to Bologna after some time to discuss with us Ukraine and the future of NATO. I'm sure that you are aware of Sir Lawrence's background. He's a very distinguished academic strategist known for his contributions on defense and international security. I won't run through his distinguished positions that he's held over the years. They're all available to you on the website. More recently, I've been following Sir Lawrence's commentary on the very delightfully named Substack blog, Comment is Freed, which I strongly commend to you. We're going to have our discussion this evening also with those who may join us online in the form of a dialogue rather than a lecture. And we'll begin with a few questions that I will pose and then open up to a broader discussion and your own participation. Those of you who may be following online, please put your questions into the chat and I will pose them as the discussion advances. I'm very tempted to begin with the current realities which are so pressing on all of us. But before doing that, I wanted to ask you whether we can situate some of these developments in a sort of longer perspective, and particularly the question about how wars end. I mean, there have been many studies. There are those who've looked at hundreds of wars and tried to tabulate different ways in which they end. But are there any lessons we can learn from history and the way other wars and conflicts have eventually ended for what is happening now and what may happen in the future in Ukraine?
I'm cautious about learning lessons from history because history is something you can learn from, but there are no rules. The problem with wars is they rarely do have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Sometimes they do, but a lot of them have uncertain starts and uncertain conclusions, and they go in stages. So when did this war start? I think most of us would probably say March 2014, with the annexation of Crimea. But that was a consequence of what Ukrainians now call the Revolution of Dignity, which began in 2013, which was a consequence of a pretty aggressive economic move by Putin against actually a tolerably friendly president in the summer of 2013. And then from 2015, there was occasional fighting, but you wouldn't say there was a war going on. Then, of course, it blew up. And that's not unusual for wars. They go in stages. And so you can never actually be sure that one has ended. I mean, my it's tragic, is Sudan, which since independence in 1956 has had 46 peace treaties. And wars come and go. And they're not quite the same each time, but you can trace one from the other. And so often the best predictor of where a war is going to happen is where a war has happened in the past, which is also a rather sad conclusion. First, it's not true that all wars end with a negotiation, which is often sort of the strap line that people use when they're about to urge some compromise on Zelensky or whatever. A lot of wars don't end with a negotiation. Some end with victory for one side, 2 world wars. And there was a negotiation, but there was capitulation first. Some peter out. Some end with a ceasefire, which can go on for a long time. The obvious one being Korea in 1953. And if I was going to guess, that's as likely as not a possibility for this one, or it'll drag on at a sort of lower level of intensity. So I think you have to look at the particulars of the situation, but I do find it helpful to think of wars in stages. that it's not a burst of activity and then which stops. It's activity, sometimes a respite, then it starts again. And that is why, as people are talking about potential ceasefire agreements, both sides are thinking about the next round of fighting that will happen should the ceasefire be broken.
Both sides have talked about victory. I mean, Ukrainians talked about victory. I mean, what would constitute victory for either side in this war?
For the Ukrainians, it would be getting their territory back. It's not very complicated, and surviving as an independent sovereign state. It's difficult. I think in the summer of 22, it was perfectly reasonable to think in those terms, but probably after the counteroffensive was sort of disappointing in 23, very hard to think in those terms. For Russia, it's much more complicated because there's big debates which go back to views about the causes of the war as to what would constitute victory. My view, which fits in with everything what the Russians say, is that victory is both territorial, and that involves more territory than they have at the moment, which is why they're demanding that Ukraine cede territory to them, and subjugation of Ukraine. Now, that can be sort of total subjugation, which is maybe what they were after in February 22, or a sufficient restrictions on their sovereignty, on interfering with their constitution, perhaps trying to change their regime, demanding that Zelensky goes, but in particular, no membership of NATO or the EU, but certainly not of NATO, and so on. So that it's incapable of being able to try to regain territory in the future. And that, I think, is Putin's problem, because I don't think he can get that. I don't think, even if Trump, in this sort of ominous phone call he's got with Putin tomorrow, agreed, he can't deliver Ukraine to that. And I think one of the important things that's happened over the past couple of weeks is a much stronger European role in the politics of all of this, as well as the military side of it. So now that I can get victory is the short answer in terms of what they want. The question is, can either side get a ceasefire with which they can live? And actually, I think that's easier for Ukraine than it is for Russia.
Yeah. I mean, during the election campaign, famously or notoriously, we heard from Trump that he could end the war in a single day. Now he says that he was sarcastic when he said that, rather odd kind of expression. But even if we don't take that seriously and literally, is there a sense beyond the bluster and the promises and the threats in which Trump may have found a way to break through the sort of blockage that there's been, because the two sides have had such contradictory war aims? And, you know, might it turn out that he has opened the way to a possible end to hostilities?
Well, I'm cautious on this, certainly less cautious than Trump. So one of the reasons that quite a lot of Ukrainians were not unhappy that Trump won was because they didn't see a way forward with Biden. He wasn't doing enough to let them win, yet he was enabled, partly because he was deferring to them, to get negotiations going. So they thought that Trump would shake things up. And it could, and you know, at the moment, they may well be right to have been positive about that. We have to see. And he has shaken things up. So the conflict has been reframed. And I think one of the problems you've got, I mean, there are many problems with Trump. In this situation, one problem is you don't get a sense he actually grasps the issues themselves. So a series of statements from Trump, whether with Macron, with Starmer, with whoever, about how much Putin is prepared to be generous. A very good example was that Putin was prepared to see European forces deployed in Ukraine as security guarantees. Yes, you know, absolutely no evidence for this. And almost as soon as he says these things, the Kremlin comes out and didn't mean that at all. So you got that as a problem. And secondly, you just got the sort of the general Trump problem is that he doesn't talk nuance. He's described having a descriptive range from gross exaggeration to complete hyperbole. There's no when he talks about things, it's always overstated, and that again makes it hard to work it out. Because I think Waltz and Rubio sort of, are of this world and seem to be knowing how to talk about these, but are sort of suspected of being a bit too sympathetic to Ukraine. Witkoff, who's the one who's been doing a lot of the actual talking to Russians, has got no particular background in diplomacy or international affairs, and you get the feeling he's been told tales. So, so you go first from the first Trump-Putin phone call. What's going on here? Trump is giving Putin everything he wants. Then it gets even worse. Starmer and Macron sort of force something back, and then Zelensky goes over and it's catastrophic, and support is withdrawn. Macron and Starmer sort of get back and coach Zelensky to abase himself and so on. Then you get the talks in Jeddah, which go really well, and Zelensky does the right thing. Military support comes back. The ball is now in Putin's court. And we don't know what's going to happen next, because everything Putin has said is that he's playing for time. He's trying to see if he can extract a bit more. I think he's trying basically to move from ceasefire to substantive negotiations. And you just don't have confidence in how Trump is going to treat that. So the danger for Ukraine is that in what is essentially playing a blame game at the moment, who is going to be responsible for the breakdown of the process? From having looked like you've maneuvered Putin into that position, the worry is that Putin will maneuver Zelensky back into that position. And we don't know. This is the point where prediction becomes almost impossible. If Trump sticks with the formulation with which he and Rubio and Waltz started, that you start with a ceasefire, then you talk substance, then the onus is still on Putin, but we'll see.
Do you think there's a sense in which, for Trump and to some extent for Putin, there's a sort of another agenda here that's superimposed on the Ukraine agenda, which you could broadly say is normalization of relations between Russia and the United States, and that both have an interest in that, and that they can exchange favors, as it were, and benefit mutually, and that what happens to Ukraine, at least for the United States, if not for Russia, is secondary to that?
I think there's some truth in that. I mean, when the first meeting in Jeddah with the American team and the Russian team, two tracks: normalization of relations and Ukraine. And the normalization track is still being pursued. Obviously, the two are pretty related in certain areas. And just to take one example, because I saw a mention of it today, the US is clearly not going to encourage the ICC to challenge Trump as a war criminal because it doesn't believe in the ICC. So there are things like that. I think in Trump's mind, he believed that a combination of normal relations, no NATO, and holding on to some territory would satisfy Putin. I just don't think that will satisfy Putin myself. But that is, I think, what Trump believes, and that he will go for normalization of relations. But he's still got to be pretty careful given things he said, because one of the things that clearly the Russians want a lot is easing of sanctions. How much that can be done without Europe, and if Putin hasn't given anything in return, it seems to me, even for Trump, quite difficult. So that's why I think many of us are watching with some trepidation this conversation tomorrow to see exactly how it works out.
Yeah. I mean, we've been, as you say, it's a process more than anything else. But as far as Europe is concerned, it's been through several iterations. I mean, to begin with, the Europeans and Ukrainians obviously felt that this was a dialogue that he wanted to start, that Trump wanted to start over the heads of Europe and over the heads of Ukrainians. There were these dreadful scenes in the White House, and then Zelensky thought better of it and said things that he thought that he had to say. And then with British support, I understand, moved in Jeddah towards some kind of understanding with the United States as to what kind of ceasefire might be aimed for. But for the Europeans too, it seemed as though we had been shuffled aside completely, and we looked rather pathetic just saying that we wanted to be part, we wanted to be there at the table. But then the reply was, yes, but what do you actually have to bring to the table? Do you think that perhaps that's changed a bit now? And partly after this initial initiative of Keir Starmer, the 2 rounds, the London meeting, the video conference, that Europe is beginning to get its act together and beginning to see that there might be an important role for Europe, particularly in any security guarantees that could be given.
Yes, I mean, I think it's changed, I think in ways that people don't fully appreciate yet. It's one of these things that maybe we'll need some distance to see, is it a turning point or was it just a diplomatic maneuver of the time? So first, it's important to note that we've reached a stage where it's very hard to coordinate transatlantic positions. I mean, this was shown particularly with the UN vote in the General Assembly, where the US voted with North Korea and Iran and Israel, and Russia and Belarus and so on, and everybody else was on the other side. Most others were all abstained, even China abstained. So you have the US not even trying to lead in some respect, and the Europeans feeling under no obligation to follow. I can't remember this really happening quite that way before. There would always be some effort. And you can see it in the G7. Now, one of the things that's happened in the G7 is that before the Jeddah talks between Ukraine and US, it was hard to get a G7 communique because the issue was, do you condemn Russia for aggression? They could get a G7 communique on the issue, should Russia respond to the call for a ceasefire, because that was an American position. But that required a certain amount of movement. Now, I think Macron and Starmer, and the two are working very close together, are working, I think, quite effectively. I mean, in very different ways, but they're working closely together with 2 basic objectives. First, not to break with the United States. They'll work with Trump, they'll try and flatter Trump. Jonathan Powell, who's the UK National Security Advisor, has spent a lot of time on the phone with Mike Waltz and so on. He's actually got a history of mediation, and he's actually quite good at it. So they've been working really hard on this. So one, you keep links going with Trump and the administration. Secondly, you guide Ukraine to positions that don't mean that Ukraine has got to make fundamental compromises, but at least keeps them close enough to the Americans so you don't get this again. And third, you prepare one way or the other for a future stage, whether this involves security guarantees or just backing Ukraine at a time when the Americans gradually reduce their influence. I don't think it makes a lot of difference. It started with security guarantees. That was the issue on which they entered the discussion. You say to the Americans, okay, we understand you're not going to take the lead in this. We're happy to take the lead, but we really need to talk to you about what this will involve and how it fits in. And Trump accepted that. And so Macron went and then Starmer went and they laid it on. And, they got the Americans agreeing in principle to that issue for future discussions with Putin. Who really doesn't want it. But the work that has now been established with this coalition of the willing is quite important, and it's, you know, again, quite unusually intensive military conversations going on amongst NATO members without the US. And it's NATO. I mean, it's important to keep in mind this is not an EU-US thing. If you look at the group that met in London in the first meeting, there were 5 non-EU NATO members, obviously Ukraine and UK, but also Turkey, Canada, and Norway. So it's not, you know, all of these issues were supposed to arise, as you know, because Europe was trying to complete itself as an entity, and so it's nothing to do with that. This is a pragmatic response to a pretty dire situation, which has brought Europeans multilaterally rather than institutionally to work together with the Canadians, who obviously got their own reasons to be pissed off with the US at the moment. Somehow brought them all together to work out something that will support Ukraine in the future. Now, you know, question: will they do enough? Can they do more? They're doing more than many expected, but probably not enough yet. But it's progress.
Can we stay for a minute or two with the security guarantees? I know it's only part of a much wider picture. To begin with, it looked as though the video conference was going to be mainly about that. So the Italian Prime Minister, to begin with, didn't want to participate because she's pretty clear that Italy will not provide troops. There's a lot of sentiment in Italy as well, pace and all of that. And but in more diplomatic terms, she said it was too sensitive a moment for a gathering that could be perceived as a kind of anti-American gathering for the Europeans to get their act together. But in the end, she came round with the sort of window dressing that the agenda had been changed, and it wasn't only about troops and so on. But what type of security guarantees could be feasible? I agree with you entirely that it's not going to be the EU. There's been a very unrealistic flurry in the Italian press and kind of debate in the PD party and elsewhere, revivals of ideas about European defense community and so on, which I think is completely unrealistic. But then what is realistic? Would some kind of Europeanized NATO without the United States, with Canada, and perhaps with some third countries, or a purely ad hoc coalition of the willing, in which case, what would be the command and control structure? Could they use NATO assets and so on? What might be, and then what about where any such troops might be located? Is it conceivable that they would be located in Ukraine, perhaps away from the demarcation line, or outside Ukraine? I mean, how should we think about this?
Well, you've raised the issues. So I think you start that you can do a lot. I mean, things happen already in NATO using NATO structures without the US. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. You have operational procedures, you have understandings that can work. And the UK does this already quite a bit on the northern tier. So it's not in itself the problem. You do have countries like Australia who may now wish to join in, but that would be a problem because they're used to working with the Brits and so on. So I think the first thing, it's not going to be EU because it's going to be Britain and France. And once the new German coalition is sorted out, the role of Germany is obviously going to be very interesting. And Merz has given himself more room for manoeuvre than you might have expected. So it's going to be multilateral using NATO structures. Britain and France. Britain, I think, and France both see this as a way of moving Britain closer to EU, but that's a side benefit rather than the main point. it's been talked about as peacekeepers, but it's not peacekeeping, and that's the wrong term. There may be peacekeepers because Putin has been talking about peacekeepers in a more traditional sort of role. And when Putin first reacted to the proposal, he raised a number of technical problems, which, to be honest, were valid and which hadn't been mentioned in the original communique. Is there going to be a clear line of separation? How will it be demarcated? Is there going to be separation of forces? How is this going to be policed and so on? And traditionally, peacekeepers would have been part of that. You could have, Indians or Bangladeshis or Chinese or whoever doing that sort of role. Now, you don't need it in the same way because actually there's pretty good intelligence as to what's going on. But that's a role. But that's not what we're talking about here. So you're talking about a deterrent force or an assurance force is the word that's being used. And this has been described as something that would be sit behind the Ukrainian front lines. And it may end up that way. You need an awful lot of troops to make that worthwhile, because you not only need, let's say you want 20,000, which is the minimum, actually in position. We actually need 60,000 troops because you need 20,000 to be training, 20,000 there, 20,000 recovering from what they've been doing, and that would be pretty minimum. So you may get there. So I think there's another model which I suspect the militaries prefer, and I suspect the Ukrainians be less keen on, is that you just build up the Ukrainian force itself. That's the first line of defense. The Ukrainians are now provide well over 50% of their own kit and ammunition and so on. They're leaders in drone technology now. You start off, the best thing you can do if you want to build up Ukraine military capacities to invest in Ukrainian defense industry. So that is happening more. That's the first thing. Then there are air and sea roles that can be played, keeping open the Baltic, keeping open the Black Sea, providing air cover, which can be critical. And you don't need the Americans to do that. So I suspect if we ever get to that stage, and I'm not convinced we will, that's the sort of thing that one might imagine. Then you have the more difficult questions about the ultimate security guarantee, which is nuclear. It's the issue nobody really wants to address. It's not that you can't. The British and the French both have got independent deterrence. This is independent, more or less, and could together they pack a punch. But you have a credibility problem enough with the American deterrent, so you'd have a credibility issue. I think it's the issue that people will try to do their best not to talk about, because there's no good answer. You just leave it to Putin's imagination about what could happen, and don't press it. I think we're a long way from that at the moment. If we're talking at the moment about a ceasefire, a month ceasefire to allow discussions on bigger issues to take place. Putin is trying to move on to the bigger issues straight away. Only if you've got a full consent to these other issues start to fall in place. I'd be foolish to say these things can't happen, but if I'm asked to describe the final deal, I struggle at the moment. So we may never get there, but that doesn't mean to say that some of the discussions don't bear fruit in terms of things that Europeans may feel they need to do just to keep the Ukrainians in the game, which may be, the next stage of the war.
Before opening up to general discussion and Q&A, maybe a few words about the future of Ukraine, also from a political perspective. I mean, I struggle very much from this, and given my background, I think it's very the EU context. I mean, my own feeling is that the EU rushed in rather quickly after February to encourage Ukraine to apply for membership in the European Union without really considering all the stages that were involved and the various obstacles that would have to be overcome on both sides. We know that from a Russian perspective, they're looking for a Ukraine that would be neutral in some sense, disarmed, obviously not a member of NATO. Whether at this stage EU membership is an issue for them or not, that would remain to be seen. But what kind of a Ukraine can we look forward to when eventually the hostilities come to an end?
It's tricky. So first, this whole business started in 2013 over an association agreement with the EU, which you well know probably wouldn't have led to very much anyway. But Putin was determined to stop it. If he just let that go through, none of this would have happened, and Ukraine still wouldn't be a member of the EU. Occasionally, you get hints from Russia that that's one of the concessions they could make. Partly on the ground, and I saw this the other day, the negotiations would go on and on forever, and the Poles and others would have their reasons to make sure it didn't happen because they wouldn't want the agricultural. It wouldn't be easy. And that's one risk, is you get massive disillusion with the West when you actually try to move from war to peace. Secondly, a large chunk of the Ukrainian population is now abroad, and a large chunk is displaced. How easy will they go home? Sure, here, but certainly in the UK, you've got Ukrainian kids at school doing fine, little Ukrainian businesses being set up. They've been 3 years, So that's a challenge. Zelensky, doubts have been cast on Zelensky's legitimacy, and so by the Russians and by Trump, under the Ukrainian constitution with martial law, and just as a practical matter, you can't have free and fair elections at the moment, but at some point you have to. And you talk to Ukrainians and they admire Zelensky in many ways, but they think he has autocratic tendencies like any guy who's been in that position for that time, and might like a change. And there are issues of corruption and so on. I mean, the Ukraine has done a lot on those issues. And there is a strong political solidarity. But like any political system, there are tensions and divisions, and these would come to the fore pretty quickly, I think, once people sort of relaxed. So I think that's true in Russia as well. I think it's true for both countries, that moving from war economies and war societies to something more normal would be an enormous shock to their systems and would open up lots of divisions and debate, probably more in Ukraine than Russia, because Putin would still be exercising control. Anyway, I think that, so it's not going to be easy for Ukraine afterwards. Its economy is not in a bad shape at the moment because it's been well supported by loans, IMF, and this interest from all the Russian seized assets and so on. And I think there are good and interesting plans that have been developed to boost the Ukrainian economy after the war. So it's not, I wouldn't want to, I think it's always good to be realistic about the problems. It's not hopeless, and there's a lot of goodwill to Ukraine, and a lot of, you've got a pretty skilled, you've still got a pretty skilled, savvy workforce. And a lot of people would go back, need to go back and support the country if they felt it was safe and stable. But that's the final point. If you want the Ukrainian economy to recover, there's no point in an uncertain, fragile ceasefire, because you want people to be prepared to invest and so on. And you don't get that if the assumption is to break up again at any moment.
Well, thank you very much. I suggest at this point that we open up And perhaps we would begin with questions that are more related to the existing situation and how it's likely to evolve, ceasefire, armistice, peace settlement, what have you. And then more towards the future, whether the future of Ukraine and a little later on, the future of NATO as such, which we haven't come to yet. And when you intervene, please just identify yourself and then give us your question. Let's begin with Sergey.
I've been already identified, so Sergey Radchenko, thank you for this very insightful presentation. With which I entirely agree. I think it was compelling, the range of options and the uncertainties that we face. But I wanted to ask a couple of very technical questions. The first is about drones. You mentioned drones, that Ukraine is now leading in the production of drones. I read somewhere that now drones are responsible for more death on the battlefield than artillery, which itself seems like a very unusual development. So would you be willing at this point to say that the drones have ushered a new revolution, military revolution on the battlefield? To what extent have they become the magic weapons? So people have been talking about magic weapons and how they never work, or have drones become the magic weapon? So that's the first question. The second question is about nuclear deterrence, and I was rereading, which of course everybody should do. You know, every year they must reread your history of strategy. Fantastic book, and in chapter 12 there's called Nuclear Deterrence, I think, or something with strategy of deterrence. And there you have this long description of wonderful debates that were happening in RAND Corporation, Thomas Schelling, and people like Herman Kahn and various others. And you talk about extended deterrence and how they were working on, we're trying to work out how to avoid the credibility problems that came up with this. And now you're talking again, touched on the question of extended deterrence, and particularly questioned American credibility when it comes to nuclear deterrence in Ukraine. But at the same time, in the same vein, you seem to suggest that French nuclear deterrent or French extended deterrent or British extended deterrent would be more credible. Is that so or not? To me, when Macron talks about extended nuclear deterrence for the Baltics, etc., it sounds even less credible than those extended deterrence debates we had with regard to Berlin and other places. So those two questions.
Okay. Drones. So you've got, it is transformational in many respects, because when the war began, everybody thought drones would be very important, but you may remember the sort of big Turkish drones that were used in an anti-tank role to start with. They were sort of large and expensive, or think about the American Emeritus and so on. Whereas what you have now are large numbers of expendable drones that tens of dollars each before you fit them out with stuff. And the Ukrainians now say their production produces them more cheaply even than China and so on. They've got it down. It's been a fascinating story in itself. Now, drones have problems. They're slow, they can be seen, they can be jammed, and when you get lots of drones just fall from the air, they're not particularly effective. So it's mass that makes the difference rather than the individual drones and their expendability. And the fact, you've got hundreds of these things above the sky at any given time, which makes movement very difficult. So it's harder to mount surprise attacks when the Russians have success in Kursk because they went through a pipeline, literally. So they were missed. You don't get many opportunities like that. So drones are important. They're vulnerable to countermeasures, and there's a constant battle going on with electronic warfare and change. It becomes very technical, and it swings from one side to the other. So I think the Ukrainians, by and large, have the advantage in this, but it's fragile and it moves. Also, it's true that drones have killed more people, that's because people have been forced out into the open, and they've often been forced out because of artillery fire. So it's always unwise to look at a single element of warfare independently of all the other elements, whether it's infantry. I mean, the Ukrainians have before had to use less infantry. They've had to use methods that avoided concentrations of forces, not because of drones, but because of glide bombs, the dumbest bombs around, cause enormous damage to Ukrainian forces. Certainly, Ukrainians have to spread their people around, and drones, a lot of them are using them drones because the Russian tactics haven't particularly evolved. They just keep on sending expendable troops towards the front. But the role of aircraft remains important. The role of artillery remains extremely important. If you're trying to draw lessons for future wars, why haven't Russian aircraft been more important in this war? How important are the F-16s and the MiGs and so on, and the Mirages that the Ukrainians have got, starting to be in terms of their air defense? So it's still pretty limited, because it's been more important. So yes, I mean it's a revolution, but it's always unwise just to look at one capability out of context. On extended deterrence, what about extended deterrence is everybody assumes you do all sorts of terrible things if your own homeland is attacked, but would you do these things for other countries? That's the basic issue. So it used to be, would the US risk New York and Chicago for Paris or Rome or Berlin or wherever? And as soon as you put the question, sort of little doubts arise. And against that, you say, well, there's something called Healy's theorem, after a former British Defence Secretary, Dennis Healy, who once said, actually, the problem of deterrence is only 5% deterring the other side, because you just have to be a bit wrong in your calculations and it's calamitous. Just one nuclear weapon has to land on your soil and it's calamitous. But the problem is assuring those who are being protected that it's credible. So it's 5% deterrence, 95% assurance. And that remains the case. Now, the UK has always committed, or not always, effectively always committed its nuclear force to NATO. France hasn't. France has found language to indicate everybody benefits from its national nuclear force, but if you look back at its origins, it was very much to protect France, not necessarily anybody else. Problems with the Germans when they first developed their nuclear force. Both countries had a theory which is originally a French theory, called second center of decision making. So the idea was that the Russians, Soviets, Russians, whatever, foolishly might assume mistakenly that the Americans wouldn't decide to use their nuclear weapons, but they'd have to make assumptions about London and Paris as well. And so the chances of them being a bit wrong with one of them reinforce deterrence. So that's fine. You can be a second center of decision making. Are you prepared to be the first? And that's the sort of issue that I think either London or Paris wholly want to address. But they are addressing them, and there are talks going on, discussions going on. Then the UK position is, look, we've made a commitment to NATO, and I'll withdrawing that commitment, make of it what you will. I think the French are going through more linguistic permutations, trying to find and the British and the French talk to each other. We've got a limited number of submarines. How do you ensure the maximum number are on station at any time? There's things you can do like that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, Prof. Freedman. Very interesting. I'm Grant Dawson. I'm an associate fellow here. Normally, I'm an assistant prof at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, China. I just have two questions, really quick ones. The first one is I noticed that you and most of the other commentary that I've read haven't proposed that element of the end of the war being UN peacekeepers, because they could be the authorization of this force would be at the UN Security Council, Russia, United States, and also Britain and France would have control over it. They could fine tune it in a careful way. Peacekeepers have been used to deal with hot conflicts in the past, in Cyprus, for example, Kashmir, more recently in Africa as well, obviously. So I was just wondering about UN peacekeepers specifically, which appears to be a little bit on Putin's mind. And the second thing is I was just wondering about Trump's involvement in encouraging negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, because it seems to me that one of the things that in particular Russia wants from the conflict is a type of status. Like, it's not just necessarily rank as a great power. I think it sees itself as a great power, confident as that, in that maybe not everybody else does. That's nevertheless Russia does. But I think in particular the thing that they miss, and in particular the thing that they want that Trump is giving Putin, is to be treated like a great power, recognition, a sort of regard, and that could be a contributor to peace in the conflict. That could be a start of what I think Russia wants. I was just wondering if you think that is a reasonable thought. Thank you.
Okay, so I mentioned the peacekeepers. If they happened, they would be under that would be a UN resolution. But these would be peacekeepers in the traditional form, sort of lightly armed, impartial, monitoring, and you mentioned some examples. You've got another example, say Lebanon, which is not desperately encouraging. Plenty of examples of peacekeepers being involved. I mean, like the recent African history is not encouraging on their own. But I think that's an option, and that's why I separated it from a deterrent force. So one thing you can be pretty sure of, if what the British and the French and the coalition of the willing wanted to do, that wouldn't be a UN resolution, because Russia would veto it. So yeah, I mean, I think if that's part of the proposal, I wouldn't rule that out. I mean, I can see how it could happen, but it wouldn't be enough. Then that would have a UN role. But you've had the OSCE was given the job of watching sort of monitoring the Minsk agreements of September 14, February 15. They were still sort of encouraging everything as the full-scale invasion was going on. I mean, they were bypassed. So the precedents are not great. The great power thing, it's clearly important to Putin. Sergei knows, going back to Khrushchev, how important this could be. That's what did Khrushchev want out of his meeting with Kennedy, partly to be recognized as an equal superpower. And this clearly weighs on Putin's mind. But he's got a problem with this, in that he's a great power because he's got nuclear weapons. Take away the nuclear weapons, and this is a country that's failed after 3 years to defeat a country sort of third of the size, is in hock to China, but declining economy over the long term. It's had a couple of years of boom, but it's now facing stagflation. So he's got a problem. I mean, it's almost international diplomacy as psychotherapy. Of course you're a great power. When did you first think that you were a great power? How do you imagine it is to be a great power? I just give you part of the problem. When we went through the first round, shall we say, of this in 2014, Putin described China as an economic superpower and Russia as a nuclear superpower. But China's becoming a nuclear superpower too. It's catching up. He's clearly the junior partner of China now, and Russia is very conscious of that. I don't see how we get out of this. This will continue. It suits China. China's perfectly okay with this new relationship. China's given very little to Russia other than keeping its economy afloat, which is a big deal. So I think Trump sees himself as playing this. I think probably Trump in his own mind does see Putin, as an equivalent strong leader. But he also knows from other things he said that the Russian economy is not in a great shape. It's less than the German economy, less than the French economy, less than the British economy, I think less than the Italian economy. So what's breaking about it? But it's I think it's one of the things Trump does feel he's offering Putin is sort of respect. But in the end, it doesn't pay the bills.
Josephine.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Josephine. I'm a second-year Maya student here from Germany. Professor Lee earlier asked about the kind of superior motivations of the US, or kind of the higher level motivations that play into decision-making that affect Ukraine. And I wonder about the same thing on the European side. So on the European side, what we had in the previous class with Professor Maya was that Europe might not have had the actual interest to see Ukraine win this war, but rather have kind of arrive at a point where Ukraine neither wins nor loses, and so does Russia. How has the European position and perspective on this war changed over the past 3 years, and specifically with Trump gaining power now? Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting and difficult. I mean, there's a famous quote, which I've had verified from somebody who was there at the Völker conference in Munich, days before the full-scale invasion, when Americans and Brits were trying to persuade the German delegation that this was really going to happen. And the comment was, well, if it does, it better be over quickly. On the grounds that we want less turbulence in Europe. And then it wasn't over quickly because the Ukrainians fought. It wasn't because of Europe, and a bit of European help, a bit of American help, but basically they fought. And so Europe came in behind, and then the more Ukrainians fought, the more they came in behind, and the states grew. But it's one of the features of warfare is that the interest with which you go into a conflict are not the same once the conflict has begun, because all sorts of reputations are at stake for the belligerents. But also, if you've said, we're with you, we're going to support you, you can't just, it's not so easy just to walk away. Well, even Trump's finding it difficult just to walk away. So the Europeans got more invested in Ukrainian victory. And as I mentioned before, I think there was a point, early September 22, when it wasn't unrealistic to believe in a Ukrainian victory. And then Putin doubled down. And I genuinely think that end of September 22 is a real turning point. When the annexation of the four oblasts was announced, when they changed the command structure, when he started mobilization, when he basically moved to a war economy in Russia. It took a while, but that was, I think, a transformational moment. So it's become much harder since then, and certainly since late 23, to talk of a Ukrainian victory. So unless you're actually going to invest even more And there's a problem there because we've been slow to get our defence industries going. You're sort of stuck with the deadlock. And I think that's become a problem. Which is why I think there's not total unhappiness that we're now talking about ceasefires. I think there would be, okay, this will give Ukraine a chance to get some breathing space to recover from the battering it's taken and so on. It's not as good as liberating all its territories, but it's not as bad as the complete subjugation people are expecting right at the start. So that's why, there hasn't been a lot of resistance to the Trump push for a ceasefire, for some sort of diplomatic activity. Just a lot of anxiety over what sort of peace Trump might think is a good peace. That's where we are at the moment. And I think one of the things that interests me is, if you try and move a number of steps ahead, is the point at which the Americans have not succeeded in this endeavor. The Europeans are doing more on balance, much more on balance for Ukraine than the US. And you go back to a European peace initiative, which is where we started and what we had in 2014-15. I don't think that's impossible. But lots of steps before we get there.
We've got a question online about Germany's changing role and Germany's likely future role in NATO. Do you think that this is a pivotal moment as far as Germany is concerned, and that we can expect Germany, both in terms of its sense of its national interests and of its willingness to spend more on the military, to play a significant role in any future Europeanized NATO?
Yes, I think, Germany got the peace dividend, did lots with it, and basically had a foreign policy that required good relations with Russia. Had an economic policy that required good relations with Russia. Now, Scholz, after the invasion, made this brave speech, and it's all recognized that something had to change, but not a lot changed in terms of defense provision, in part because the budgetary flexibility wasn't there. Now, Merz has done something about that. And of course, you've got to remember, as Merz was being elected, as the Christian Democrats were becoming the largest party, you have one vice president coming to Munich and saying disobliging things about Europeans and particularly about Germany, and the other vice president, Musk, on his on X, promoting the AfD, promoting extremists. It's a potential German party. So I think for Germany, which an essential part of its security has been the transatlantic relationship, and utterly loyal to that, this was a big shock, which Merz sort of reflected in almost his first utterances as the election results came in. Now, he hasn't, because he's not formally Chancellor yet, he hasn't yet been part of the conversations with Trump, though he has part of the sort of triumvirate of Scholz as well, but with Britain, France, Germany are sort of going back to old habits and becoming sort of the driving force of the new European policy. But he will be playing that role, and they're critical. And if Germany, precisely because its debt position hasn't been as bad as everybody else's, is now able to take more risks, then its ability to ramp up support will be significant. So over time, potentially, it will be important. But we've got to see, and you have to see the coalition agreement and so on.
Thank you. Eleonora, 3 short questions. Why don't you take 3 people who are sitting close to each other? Very short questions.
Hi, thank you. I'll make my question short. When it comes, so you mentioned that NATO should have, the EU is unlikely to take a command role, so to speak, regarding like a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. In that case, what role do you think the European Union would or should play?
European Union.
Okay, role for the EU. There was another question on this side of the.
It's another short question now, so I don't know. Okay, anyway, are you familiar with Justin Brong's argument about air superiority?
Remind me.
Basically, his argument is that European air forces are superb at air-to-ground operations, and therefore the Europeans should invest into air forces instead of pouring their money into the armies, right? And assuming this is correct, and assuming that they can penetrate the Russian IATs, would it be possible to have European air forces play a substantial role instead of boots on the ground in some sort of peace thing? Yes, I think.
Thank you. And the final question on this one.
Thank you so much. I'm Daria Lange. I'm also a German second year Maya student. I have two quick questions. One of them, today the news broke that 30 countries are committing forces to this peace force. And I was wondering just if you had any insight of what the mood was like, how committed those countries were. And the second one, because we keep talking about peacekeepers, I'm not sure I understood you correctly. So you assume that either there's going to be a peacekeeping force traditionally in the UN Security Council mandated sense, which would mean Russia would have to approve it, or there's one without a UN Security Council approval. And then I was wondering why no one was talking about R2P, or whether you think that's dead, or whether that could have been just, I don't know, somewhere, a way to frame it. I just haven't heard it and I was surprised. Thank you.
Okay, well, dive into whichever of these
Well,
questions
that's
you
right.
would like.
I don't think there's a large EU role. They don't have the command structures. In the UK, doesn't always provide the forces, but it's very good at providing command structures. So I don't think there's a big issue with command structures if you have to provide them. I think the EU has got really important roles to play in support of Ukraine, sanctions, promotion of defense industry, and so on. And I think von der Leyen has done a lot in these areas, but I don't think it's really up to an operational role this year. The air superiority point, I think that's true. I don't think the Russian Air Force has covered itself in glory in this war, and a lot has been learnt about it. And I think you see quite a lot of discussion going the rounds about, and I think I mentioned, rather than concentrate so much on land forces, look to air and maritime. Maritime is also important. How much of this you can do without the Americans is an issue. Sort of hanging over this is the Libya precedent, 2011, when British and French sort of zoomed in to take on Gaddafi's forces, and then suddenly realized they couldn't do very much without American support. So I think that's an issue that's present. But in principle, you're right. I mean, I think air power is important, but Europe just needs to do more on enablers and so on, but intelligence and so on. On the UN, I mean, how committed are the 30? I don't know. I mean, it's it's like sitting in class and everybody puts their hands up when the teacher says who's a volunteer. You have to see what happens when push comes to shove. There's lots of bits and pieces. I mean, it's like, past coalitions of the willing, when everybody's got a spare medical support unit to offer. You've got to know who's got the hard capability. But, there are plenty. I think people underestimate the difference that Finland makes to NATO and European security with Sweden. I mean, the two together, but particularly Finland, because of the depth it provides and so on. I don't think the Russians miss that. And they have experience. So, you know, I think there are possibilities. R2P, responsibility to protect. I think we're beyond that. I mean, I think oddly the Russians invoke it more as to why they have to look after their poor beleaguered Russian speakers in Ukraine. They invoke it as much as anybody else. So I think there's two tracks. There's the European, Canada, Australia, hard power track, and there's a potential UN peacekeeper track. I don't actually think the two are exclusive. I think you can imagine circumstances where hard, but both are in play. In that you have that while at the same time allowing Ukraine to rebuild and rearm and get backing from supporters. You can imagine, but only the UN is only relevant with the ceasefire, with the peacekeepers.
Couple of questions online. One, I think you've already answered about the EU's future role, unlikely in a purely military sense, I would say. But there's a question about whether NATO has a future without the United States.
I mean, the point of NATO, the point of the Treaty of 1949 was to tie the United States into the security of Europe. That's what it was about. You had before that Western European Union, but the idea was always that you had to find a way of drawing the Americans in. I mean, there's two scenarios. There's one which we know, or John Bolton tells us, that Trump talked about at the end of his first term, which is just straightforward. I've had enough of NATO. We don't want to be part of it anymore. And you can't rule that out. I mean, this is a pretty destructive government. I mean, it likes disruption. Trump has said that's not his intention. So the second possibility is sort of you maintain the organization, but it's not the same. And you have doubts about Article 5 just simply because you can't quite bring yourself to believe if the moment came that the Americans would be there. I think it's tricky. I think we're probably moving to a third possibility, which is not the most dire, which is a sort of gradual shrinking of the American footprint. I think that's almost certain. There'll be some shrinkage of the footprint, that more forces will be committed in the Pacific, or indeed to border security or whatever. I think that's likely, except it's supposed to be having the studies done. Issues obviously arise about the NATO commands at some point, and there's a symbolic moment quite early on when there was a meeting of the Ramstein Group, which is the one that organizes the donors to Ukraine, where Hegseth, as the new American Secretary of Defense, handed over to John Healey, his UK counterpart, and said, "You chair it, not me." Now, he was happy to do so, but I think it's going to be problematic for the Americans to say these are your responsibility while they're still actually quite engaged. I just think it's something that's going to be quite hard, and the American military in particular are going to push very hard against it. Why do we want to give up our command roles? I mean, we have some control. If with EUCOM, with SACEUR, and so on. So I think there's a lot of issues down the line that have not been addressed yet because we don't quite know what's being planned. I think the view in London, Berlin, Paris, I guess Rome too, is that you've got to prepare for this. You've just got to assume that we do more now. Even if you've still got NATO going, even if you've still got American commanders around, we just do more now. And frankly, if you can cope with the Russians stuck in Ukraine, you really ought to be able to cope with the rest. You know, this is still, Russia may spend over 8% of its GDP on defense, but it still has got, you know, ought to be containable by the European countries. And it, you know, just needs a different mindset that Trump has encouraged, facilitated.
But with a reduced American footprint, you put yourself in the position of NATO members who have a high level of threat perception, the Baltic, Sweden, and so on. I mean, ought they in the future to look to NATO, such as it may remain, for deterrence and if necessary defense? Or with a reduced American footprint, has NATO as such lost its credibility and we ought to be looking for alternative arrangements?
I think they're going to hold on to it for as long as they can. I mean, it's very expensive, long-term business to wean yourself away from it. It really is. That's been the problem in the past. I think it's better to accept and demonstrate that there's a rebalancing going on, and don't force the issue. I mean, the Americans may force it onto us, in which case, you know, we have to cope. But if the Americans don't force it onto us, I don't think we should particularly invite us. I mean, you know, by the time the second Trump administration ends, on the assumption he doesn't change the constitution so there's a third, you know, there'll still be something recoverable in all of this. So I don't think they'll push. But clearly, it goes back to the German question and so on. You're going to reassure countries that are genuinely nervous about what the Russians may do next. Then you're going to have to show support. You know? And you look at the polls, who are going to 4% GDP, and they're building quite elaborate defenses now. I mean, they take it very seriously. They think this is a real thing. And that's not unusual in Northern Europe at the moment.
We have time for a last round of short questions.
Thank you. Enjoyed your talk very quick, and I'll be very quick. Are we also seeing the end of the United States? We've been talking about Russia is not really a superpower and it needs psychotherapy to make it think it is. Is it also the case that the United States itself is not on that level anymore? And isn't that part of the reason for its policy? Or possibly is not. I just put this as a hypothesis. This is a country that has a budget of just under 7 trillion and is borrowing 2-point-something trillion per year in order to finance its government, and is promising 600 billion of tax cuts a year over the next 5 years, and has members of the Republican Party saying a country that spends 25% of its GDP has something wrong with, but for its government, cannot consider itself a functioning economy, but it can't consider itself a functioning great power either. Question mark.
Okay, 1 or 2 last questions from people we haven't heard from yet. Perhaps, yeah.
My name is Simon. Thank you for your talks, everyone. My question is regarding these peacekeeping forces that we've been talking about. You know, Putin seems to be very clear that no NATO forces should be in Ukraine. When we have our group of willing stating that they are willing to send forces there, are they basically posing something that they know won't be accepted? Is this sort of part of the calculation, do you think? And yeah, I was wondering about the strategy behind all that.
The last question online, which are whether there could be a role for mediation and large scale sort of peace conferences, with a reference to a conference that Switzerland convened in Bergenstock last year. Could there be a kind of approach to peacekeeping? Mediation.
Let me take them in reverse order. It's interesting. So the Swiss did host a conference last year, but this was largely Ukrainian instigation. And was fine, but was designed to get support for Ukrainian peace proposals, which involve reparations and all the environmental damage and war crimes and so on. So fine, but it's not mediation of the sort. At some point, if there's ever made progress, the US or somebody is going to have to mediate. And this can be proximity talks, or you could have the US talking directly to the Russians, talking directly to the Ukrainians, which they've done before. I mean, they did in March, April. It's written about March, April 22. I mean, I think the talks failed for a variety of reasons. The Russians claim these to be the starting point for the new talks. So you can imagine if conversation between the two sides is difficult, then some sort of mediation going on. I don't think this would be sort of the side time conference. Or you can imagine lots of working groups and so on being set up to address particular issues. We're a long way from that. I think you've basically got to get agreement on territory and what sort of droit regard that Russia has over internal Ukrainian politics and security. And if you say no, then things become a lot easier. But as long as they say yes, I can't see how you make any progress. So yeah, on peacekeepers, so offering on the assumption that they won't be required, sort of maybe an offer I can refuse. And there's sort of, I don't think that's the motivation. I think this started with the concern that the US was going to agree to something and then not be there to back it up. And that's how the discussion started. And then one thing leads to another. And as always, you end up in a different place to the one in which you started. Clearly, the Russians don't want any Western forces based in Ukraine. Absolutely clear on that. Trump says he thinks it could be a good idea. So it's going to be one of those other issues where, you know, who persuades Trump and how much, what are the showstoppers in this? Well, you know, where are everybody's red lines? And we'll find out. You know, I think the Russians have got lots of red lines. And the Ukrainians have got their red lines. And, you know, how much Trump understands this, who knows? Now, interesting question. So, you know, we're going through something at the moment that's hard quite to fathom. You know, the US is cutting its soft power, literally, you know, Voice of America going, full right, you know, one thing and another,
USAID. USAID.
USAID. So all of that's and bits of it may return. I suspect they'll find they need bits and so on. They're desperate to keep the dollar as a reserve currency. And I think they probably will, but there's not any of these alternatives. But it's a moment there too. And you raise the debt issue. And you know, international markets have been happier. I mean, they're not in a good place at the moment. And you know, I think you're as likely as not to see a major financial crisis this year. It's not prediction again. But the debt issue, there'll come a point where people don't want to take American debt. And you're already reaching the point where servicing the debt is bigger than the Pentagon budget. You know, so yeah, this is still a remarkably powerful country. It still is a quarter of the world's GDP. It's still self-sufficient essentially in energy, in food. It can look after itself. It needs the rest of the world less than the rest of the world needs it. I mean, you know, that's basically the problem. But it's creating chaos in international trade. It's picking totally unnecessary fights with its closest neighbors. And you know, we're coping at the moment because we assume certain thing that Trump says he wants to happen won't happen, like annexation of Greenland or coercing Canada into becoming the 51st state, which Democrats should be encouraging like crazy, because that would completely change the balance of power within the US. But you know, so it's just that may affect his state visit to the King of Canada, who happens to be the King of the UK. So you know, I think it's a moment, and I think what we went through some of these moments last time, and in the end we got through it. I think this is, to me, this feels different and more dangerous. And you know, you've got a very factionalized White House at the moment. You know, you've got the people who play the role of the adults in the room, as we used to call them in Trump 1, Rubio, Waltz, and so on. You've got the Vance, Musk, Trump Jr. faction, who are very hostile to Europe and to Ukraine. You've got the those who care only about immigration. So, and in the middle of this, you've got a man who you know, regularly says things which aren't true yet appears to believe them, and so it's a weird situation. Right? You know, I've been going at this game for a very long time, and I can't remember anything like this, I mean, at all. So you have a system, international system, which has been built around a United States with about 70 or so different connections, treaties, partnerships, understanding. So it's potentially quite scary, I think. But how this will work out, at what point people in Congress and so on say, well, you got a bit too far this time, I don't know. But it keeps us all busy.
Well, thank you for helping us to understand this immensely complicated situation. We'll be back to Bologna again soon. Thank you so much.
You as well.
Let's get to the